Just when I think I know everything I need to know about the Dutch colonial empire and the VOC or the Dutch East India Company, turns out I did not. A few years ago there was this article of Ewald van Vught about opium and the Netherlands. He said that the Dutch government essentially ran a drug cartel and it sold opium to fund its colonial wars. So I ended up doing a deep dive in the subject, found loads of different articles, and decided to tell all of you about it. So currently the Netherlands is known for tolerating, not legalizing, weed. Weed is up to 5 grams is decriminalized. Besides that, using drugs is very common for a lot of young adults, and adults, they use drugs when they head to festivals, something like that. It has turned into the most normal thing and it's very available. You can just send a text on WhatsApp and within 5-10 minutes or half an hour or an hour, you can have the drugs in your hand. So using any type of drugs has been extremely normalized in the Netherlands, and it is more accessible nowadays than 10 or 20 years ago. Where drugs were first mainly used in niche groups, nowadays it's throughout the entire society. So yeah, where it's very common to use drugs through all levels of society nowadays, that wasn't the case when we go back to some 100 years ago, when the Netherlands was sailing and murdering all across the globe to expand their colonial empire, and when the Dutch government started running a drug cartel. So from the 17th century until the 1950s, the Netherlands made a crazy amount of profit from the opium trade, with Indonesia as its trading center, because that's where we obtained the monopoly. Obtain sounds nicer than it actually went, but it is said that in total, converted into euros and today's money, roughly 80 billion euros was earned during that time period in the opium trade. But where did this money go? Historians and researchers say that it mostly went to the Dutch East India Company for colonial wars, paying soldiers, clerics, officials, materials and so on, to the Dutch government, but also to a small group of nobles, tenants and some members of the Dutch royal family. So 80 billion euros, it's not too shabby if you ask me. You can give me some. A lot of soldiers also used opium as well as workers, so it was also an basically ideal way to not only fill the pockets of the governments and colonial elite, but also a great way to keep the locals dependent on the colonizer, as they need the drug in their daily life and, to keep them quiet. We need to know a little bit more about the history of the colonial empire. So between 1594 and 1602, several Dutch companies were founded that started trading, mostly in spices, across Asia. At that time, the Dutch East India Company didn't exist just yet. It's the year 1596. On the first ever Dutch expedition, 4 Dutch merchant ships arrived on the 22nd of June at the Strait of Sunda between Sumatra and Banten in Indonesia. They arrived there for the very first time. More than half of the 249 crew members died either by starving, dehydration or diseases. In a typical Dutch manner of pushing on, they continued the journey. The Dutch ships were then guided to the city of Banten, the capital city of the Banten Sultanate, by a local sailor. Now at that time the Sultanate stretched from the west of Java to the south of Sumatra. Now the very first expedition wasn't a financial success for the Dutch companies. They only returned with 245 bags of pepper, 45 tons of nutmeg, bales of maize, which is the seed coat of the nutmeg, and some Chinese porcelain. And this barely covered the cost of the journey, and they returned with a much smaller crew than they left with. And you might wonder, why didn't they stop then? Even though it didn't bring in much money and they lost a big part of the crew, it was actually a confirmation that they could, on their own, successfully sail to Indonesia and participate in the spice trade themselves, instead of being dependent on other countries. It was basically confirmation to just organize some more expeditions, and they did. So now they knew what worked, they saw the potential, and where other worldwide powers were already trading in Indonesia at the time, the Netherlands didn't just yet, but they did see that there was a lot of money there. And that is why in the following year there were 6 more of these expeditions to Indonesia, and this was the start of the Dutch spice trade. And in 1602 the VOC was eventually founded. But modern day Indonesia didn't exist at the time. It existed out of smaller kingdoms, mini-states, sultanates, The power of the Dutch was relatively small back in 1618, but after the Dutch has pushed out the Portuguese, the colonized area was expanded. And what started with trading posts turned into a big colonized area, which was spread over time to the entire area of modern day Indonesia. Now during all of these centuries, in these Indies, the Dutch government was, besides spices, also a really big fan of opium. After all the profits that they made of that specific trade financed the conquering and occupying armies in the colonies. So on the Dutch side, the profits were the main source of cash money for the payment for soldiers, clerics, officials, like I said before. People still doubt the origin of opium in the Indonesian archipelago, but it is said that Arab traders have brought and traded opium in modern-day Indonesia since the early modern period. However, during that first phase, it is said that Arabic and Chinese traders mostly used it as a medicinal plant on a small scale. Then when the Portuguese colonists came, it was also said to be a relatively small byproduct compared to their entire trading chain. However, it really went up a notch, and with a notch I mean times 1,000, during the Dutch colonial time in Indonesia. So the opium trade was very important and it made a lot of money, but for a trade that, made us so much money, it's not really surprising that basically no Dutch history book in high school talks about this part of the Dutch colonial time. So when the VOC was just founded, which was 1602, VOC captains already took crates with opium from Turkey, Persia, but especially India, and within India, Bengal, to the East Indies. In the beginning, the Dutch East India Company bought the raw opium in Bengal and exchanged it for spices in the Indonesian archipelago. So this was all meant for trading, not for their own use, not to sell, just to trade for spices. So a big portion was used as a form of payment for spices in other areas in Asia, such as for getting black pepper in Kochi in India. Now the VOC never colonized Bengal, simply because they knew not to mess with them. The VOC was only a trader here and not a government adjacent. Their influence never reached beyond their enclave walls or trading posts, which was basically a warehouse, some houses, walled garden. But why didn't, they try? Well, Bengal was a flourishing Asian power. Fertile, densely populated, and they mainly made their money by trading in silk, opium, sugar, and saltpeter, used for gunpowder. The rich land and its location of Bengal in the Bay of Bengal helped it become an economic powerhouse. Plus, the increase of trade in the Indian Ocean also wasn't too shabby. So Bengal was a powerhouse, but not just economically, also military-wise. They were at the same level of the VOC, and you do not want to mess with people that are at the same level as you, because you will be crushed. It will cost a lot of money, it's not what you want. So the Bengali society was controlled by a network of Mughal administrators, landlords and lenders. They were merchants from all parts of India, but also from Persia, Maldives, Armenia and beyond. But also some Europeans were found there. In the beginning, the Portuguese were found in Bengal, but they ended up being power hungry, which, the new Shah Jahan didn't appreciate. So he chased the Portuguese away from the land in 1632. And at the same time, he then gave the English and Dutch permission to open up a trading post. But both the Dutch and English knew not to make the same mistake as the Portuguese did, so they stayed small and also didn't try to create monopolies on certain products. In the hinterland of Bengal, people have been producing opium since the 15th century, at least. And this opium was shipped all over India. And over the centuries, the Dutch East India Company started obtaining a monopoly on opium in the Indonesian archipelago, so that is what they had. In the VOC, for instance, they obtained the monopoly to ship opium to the Central Javan Empire of the Mataram Sultanate around the 1680s. And the VOC made quite a significant amount of money. 50% of all income in Batavia, nowadays Jakarta, came from opium. And because at that time, slowly but surely, the Dutch East India Company controlled the opium markets in the Indonesian archipelago, they became one of the biggest traders in narcotics in the world. And they were also partially responsible for creating a very big Asian sales market for opium. Now, in 1679, the representatives of Holly in Bengal were told by the Governor-General in Batavia that opium was more important than silk and was the most important trading product for the VOC from that moment on. However, they were never able to keep a constant flow of opium from there, simply because, the Mughal governor, he didn't give them the monopoly on opium, so he also gave opium to the English and so on. In the second half of the 17th century, like I said, the VOC got a monopoly on the import of opium on a big part of Java, and that made the involvement of the company in drug trade a lot bigger. However, at that time, the sale of opium to users was in private hands and not done by the company, just yet. So for instance, in 1613, the VOC shipped 200 pounds of opium to the Moluccas in Indonesia. In 1677, big parts of the middle of Java were conquered by the VOC, and they created a monopoly for themselves that only they could import opium on the island. Chinese tenants bought the opium and then sold it to consumers, and that, lasted for around 2 centuries. Both the VOC, the Dutch government, and Chinese tenants made bank from the opium trade. What also happened was the smuggling of opium by members of the Dutch East India Company, plain good old corruption, all over the place, from their trading locations in the Bengal to the Indonesian archipelago. There were times that high-positioned VOC employees sent out more than double, triple, or more than the official amount of opium from Bengal. And that was also one of the reasons why being stationed for the VOC in Bengal was very popular, because then when they would return to the Netherlands, to Dutch society, they could live a luxurious life with money that they obtained in Bengal in a few years. Now, their normal VOC salary was nothing compared to the money they made with the illegal drug trade. The VOC, understandably, wasn't a fan of the smuggling of opium, so they tried to make it stop. They weren't very successful. For instance, in 1720, 30,000 pounds of illegal opium was discovered in Batavia, but they still tried nonetheless. And at that time, Governor-General van Imhoff, he founded the Opium Sociëteit in Batavia in 1745 to lower the business risk, stop the smuggling of opium, and regulate the opium trade through a separate company. The shareholders of the Sociëteit were all VOC officials, and the company was basically under the wings of the VOC, as they had around half of all of the stocks of the company. 300 shares were issued, and the Opium Society was authorized to sell the opium directly through retailers. These shares were 4,800 guilders each, and that was a lot, which explains why only the super wealthy could afford it. So they could sell it to retailers. But retailers could not just buy one chest of opium, no. They had to buy at least 1,200 chests of opium for a fixed price. The VOC made a profit of 600 guilders for every chest of opium that was sold. Easy money for both the VOC and the small club of already wealthy people, as those were the only ones that could afford the shares. The stock owners also got a return on investment on every share each year. And in 1770, over half the shares were owned by around 40 shareholders living in the Netherlands. This opium society only partially worked because the opium prices were so high, the smuggling continued, and the English competition also didn't help. It is said that these people, from the founding of the society in 1745 until the dismantling of the VOC in 1800, were able to put around 30 million guilders in their pockets, which would be around 1 million guilders today. Yeah. So the drug monopoly was also most definitely filled with corruption, back in the day already. So the VOC officially existed from 1602 until 1798, and it stopped for several reasons, because of the Fourth Dutch-Anglo War, which took place from 1780 until 1784, the French occupation of the Netherlands, corruption and some other things, as well as the loss of the very valuable opium trade to the English, who got the monopoly, in a not very nice way, on opium in 1773. And while the VOC was officially dismantled in 1800, the Dutch government continued with the opium trade on its own. So it's 1800, the VOC is officially gone, but the opium trade continues. After all, there's a lot of money involved, and who doesn't want to have more money? Right. And that is exactly where the Dutch royal family comes in. So in 1826, King Willem I, he decided that the Nederlandse Handelsmaatschappij, NHM, which was founded 2 years earlier, was going to be the company that got the monopoly of selling opium on Java and Madura, which is an island east of Java, for the next 3 years. Now, why did he give it to the NHM? You want to guess? The company was founded by Mr. King Willem I himself on the 9th of March 1824. He was a major shareholder and was heavily involved in all of the operations of the company. And fun fact, the NHM is the forerunner of the Dutch bank ABN AMRO. The more you know. The company was founded as the successor of the bankrupt Dutch East India Company. Obviously, you didn't think they would just let all of that go, right? It was created to not only develop existing trade relations between the Netherlands and all the overseas territories and to create new ones, but also to collect taxes, both monetary and natural ones. Think of sugar, for instance. And the NHM also operated as a state banker, trading company, and as a carrier. Why not do all of the things together? Now, these are some big words, but essentially, he could control everything in the Dutch colonial empire. He could basically subject all colonial trade and administration under state control and military coercion. His arm reached the farmers in the Dutch East Indies to the mines in the colonies and so on. Willem I was the reason the Dutch writer Eduard Douwes Dekker, also known as Multatuli, wrote his book Max Havelaar, in which he mentions that there is a raid state between Oost-Friesland and the Scheldt River. Opium was important in the Nederlandse Handelsmaatschappij. In fact, it played a very central role. Opium trade and the use of opium were very important to keep on making a lot of money. An example was found in the Indonesian island Belitung. During the Dutch colonial time, there were tin mines on the island, and the Chinese workers of the mines used a lot of opium. At the same time, the circumstances in these mines were horrendous, so the consumption of opium was almost needed to keep on working. A lot of workers died because of their addiction to opium and the exploitation in these mines. Not only would they use opium that the Dutch brought in and sold and made bank from, but these workers dying was so common and part of the job that the mortality percentage of miners was a fixed column in the mining accounts. The mines on the Indonesian island of Belitung is where the Billiton maatschappij came from. As Billiton is a Dutch name for Belitung, the island, the Billiton maatschappij was a Dutch mining company that played an important role in tin and ore mining in the Dutch East Indies in the 19th and 20th century and after the independence of Indonesia. It was later sold to other companies and finally ended up merging, and it is now part of BHP Billiton, which is the largest mining company in the world. So, the NHM got the monopoly on selling opium for 3 years, but it didn't just stay at the monopoly for 3 years, obviously. The net profit of the NHM between 1825 and 1833 was around 6 million guilders, and half or so, around 3 million guilders, were earned by the trade of opium. But it wasn't enough because there was a small problem, a big one actually. The growing wealth and power of the Chinese tenants was a problem for the Dutch government, so they decided to take the entire opium chain in their own hands, from raw material to the user. So before the government had the whole chain of opium in their hands, opium was mostly regulated through a sort of lease system. With the help of auctions, the Dutch state authority in the Dutch Indies regulated the sale of opium, where they sold monopoly rights to individuals or groups of individuals. Once they had obtained the rights, they had to buy the raw opium from the state and were granted the monopoly to sell opium in their specific area. Now eventually there were also worries about the growing use of opium. Obviously when you use drugs for a period of time it causes health issues, increase in crimes, so on. Back in the Netherlands, the state sort of tried to decrease the number of sale points of opium, but with everything that is being restricted, that led to a rapid increase of the smuggling of opium. Then by the end of the 19th century, there was a new idea surrounding the use of opium, complete control of the entire chain, so that is what they eventually did. It was inspired by the French, who introduced their control of opium in Indochina in 1881. The idea was that by having the entire chain in government control, that it would push back criminals, basically, health risks, and so on. Now we did go a little bit further than the French, as the French were the wholesaler, but the Dutch controlled everything to retail. Also, fun fact, the special government entity that was created for the entire opium process was supervised by an office of the Dutch Ministry of Finance. They started testing the entire new supply first on the island of Madura in Indonesia, with the Dienst der Opiumregie, or Service of Opium Control, in 1894. First, the state monopoly on opium trade was extended to retail. Servers started to learn how to purify the opium and also how to cook it so local users would want to keep on buying it, as they had a specific taste. After that, it was introduced in most parts of Java, and this way of controlling the Dutch opium trade was implemented all over the Dutch Indies by 1914. Now, the government itself, like I said, learned to purify and cook raw opium to the taste of the local users. At the state Struiswijk, raw opium was prepared into smoked opium, and more than 1,000 employees were working in this factory alone. The smoked opium was then packaged into certified tubes and tubs, which made it easy to differentiate between the state opium and the smuggled opium. And of course, you want as little smuggled opium as possible because, that means less money for you. So officials with a fixed salary would start selling the opium in official opium shops straight to users. Everything was in the hand of the Dutch, from buying it in Turkey, India or anywhere else to selling it to the users. In the early 1900s, the Dutch Indies government imported more than 100 tons of raw opium, which then turned into 70 tons of smoked opium. And it didn't just stay on Java and Madura, but also many other islands. Now, like I said before, the Dutch state also started to realize the issues that came with the use of opium. Therefore, in the early 20th century, they created a licensing system that was meant to stop the use of opium slowly, sort of. They gave out licenses to active users, and new ones were only given out on a doctor's note and so on. Those with a license could only buy a small amount of opium each day and a maximum amount each month. But while it was meant to decrease the amount of opium users and the amount of opium that was used, it led to an increase of illegal consumption, so by the end of the 1920s, the licensing system was made more flexible and it was easier to get a new license. Now, while there were a lot of users, the price of opium in the Dutch Indies wasn't cheap. One had to pay 70 cents for a gram of opium, which was 12 cents in Formosa, or nowadays Taiwan. That was a good thing though, because the average consumption in the Dutch Indies was around 300 grams a year, and in Formosa it was 1.1 kilogram. And it is said that the price increases led to less use of opium, but the entire opium system continued until the Dutch East Indies was invaded and conquered by Japan in the 1940s. Now, there was some critique on the opium trade within the Netherlands, but most people weren't aware of the opium trade. The ones that were aware and tried to critique it weren't exactly welcomed in doing so. There was an editor-in-chief of the Batavia's Nieuwsblad who lost his job and position in society because he criticized the so-called opium politics of the Dutch government in the early 1900s. There were more people that criticized it and stated that it had a negative socio-economic effect, but until the 1920s there was little to no real big change in the entire system. It was mostly NGOs that created medical facilities for addicts, launched campaigns against opium, and so on. In the Dutch East Indies, opium was for the workers what alcohol was in Europe in the 19th century basically. Opium was also deemed to have a healing effect, like healing properties, just like alcohol, so it was prescribed by doctors against diseases, someone who was given to little kids to stay calm. And whenever people would criticize the opium policies of the Dutch government, the Dutch government would say they had no choice, because if the government wouldn't sell opium, then there would be a lot of opium smuggled into the country, and then the use would have increased a lot, according to them. Those that criticized it saw it for what it mostly was. The government and VOC stimulated the use of opium because it made them money. A lot of it.